Thank you. I always forget that part. Okay, recording in progress. So I am Jamie Jeanette. I'm with Health, Housing, and Homeless Services. You are here for one of our monthly trainings. So Health, Housing, and Homelessness is with Contra Costa Health. We are kind of the holders of the big picture of our homeless system of care. And one of the things that we do is provide trainings for all of the homeless service providers in Contra Costa. And we in particular have an eye towards things that are required both by federal funders and as well as what we've set up for our system of care. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But what we're here to talk about today is the Violence Against Women Act compliance and strategies for serving survivors of domestic violence. Just a little housekeeping. So we're going to keep you muted unless it's explicitly a time to ask questions. So we have the power behind the scenes. It's nothing personal we're going to have probably 100 people at least on here. So just trying to minimize chaos. If you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or do your little virtual raise hand feature. If you're waving your hand, we might not be able to see you. But we will also listen. I know some of you might be driving or in places where you can't use that feature. We'll have you, when there's times for questions, we'll also give a pause for people that may want to unmute at that time. Some basic training norms and agreements. So we're asking folks to respect the trainers and other attendees. Make space, take space, and share the mic is really about making sure, like, I'm a big talker, so I need to challenge myself to sit back for a minute and not ask a bunch of questions. For other folks that may be a little quieter, this might be a good time to step forward and take the mic virtually. And then acknowledging power and privilege. Just for many of you, this is probably familiar, but we offer these trainings typically on the second Monday of every month. And most of them are required for direct service staff and program managers. So some trainings are required under HUD. And HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They're really the biggest funder of homeless housing and services. But others we've decided as a community that are really important for us locally. So what we started doing is outlining for each of our trainings why it's required or who's requiring it, just in case those breadcrumbs are helpful for you. This is super nerdy technical stuff, but basically that's in the HUD regulations where it says we have to do a training on this, and also in our written standards. Shelby, I'm going to turn it over to you for a second.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Shelby Ferguson, Continuum of Care Administrator at H3. Just want to remind folks that attendance is required for direct service staff. You all know who you are at this point. H3 is monitoring that just to make sure you have at least one staff attending. We know you might not be able to send every single one of your staff. Totally understand. And if you can't make it, just please let me or Jamie J or both know so we can send you the recording and make sure you get it later. And then, of course, when you meet with me quarterly, we'll talk about attendance. Thanks, everybody.
So the other thing, just as we are about to roll in, we're also really this year working on trying to integrate equity and thinking about equity into all of our work that we're doing, including trainings. So as we're going through this training, just hold in your mind, are there inequities that you've seen? And it could be around gender, race, ethnicity, age, all of these things. There may be inequities between different groups of people. Are there ways that you may have contributed to or interrupted inequities? And just to put a finer point, so inequities basically means when things are not equal for all people, right? So when you see differences in maybe what's happening to different people or the outcomes based on different characteristics that they may or may not have control over. And then what barriers still exist and how might they be addressed? So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our trainers and they're going to introduce themselves, but just a quick note, we have folks from Home Base and also from Stand for Families Free of Violence. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to them.
Thanks, Jamie. All right, and thanks everyone for being here today. We have a long training ahead with a lot of content, but hopefully it's really hopefully you all get some good information out of it. So All right, so yes, today we're here for the VAWA Compliance and Strategies for Serving Survivors training. My name is Alex Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, aya, and I am with Home Base. If you could go to the next slide, thanks, Riley. And I'm here with my colleague, Riley. Do you want to introduce yourself, Riley?
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Riley Mee from Homebase. I'm a research associate and happy to be here with you all this morning.
Thanks, Riley. And Michelle is also here. Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Michelle Burns, Directing Analyst, and I'll be mostly just here for the Q&A portion.
Thanks, Michelle. And then folks from H3, Jamie and Shelby already kind of introduced yourselves, but Mary, I saw you're on the call as well, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Mary Juarez Fitzgerald, Coordinating Entry Manager here with H3. I'll toss it to Brittany from my team as well.
Thanks, Mary.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Brittany Ferguson, Coordinated Entry Specialist here at H3. I will pass it over to Kate.
Hey everyone, my name is Kate. I think I'm having some video issues, but I'm here. I'm the newest coordinated entry specialist here at H3 and looking forward to getting to know our providers through these trainings and other opportunities too.
Thanks, Kate. I believe that's all from H3, or am I missing anyone?
We
Oh,
have
hi.
Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie Siva. I'm the other coordinated entry specialist here with H3. Nice to see everybody.
Thanks, Natalie. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
All right, we can go to the next slide. And as Jamie suggested, we also have some of our colleagues from STAND, Paulina and Adriana, and I believe Selena as well. Do y'all want to introduce yourselves? They will be presenting on strategies for serving survivors.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Paulina Fregoso. I know on the slide it says it has a P for my last name, but it's Fregoso. And I am the volunteers manager and trainer for Stand for Families Free of Violence. And I'm here with my colleague, Adriana. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi,
Thanks,
everyone.
Paulina. Sorry about that. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Adriana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana. I am the housing coordinator for Stand for Families Free of Violence.
Thanks, Adriana. Is Selena on the call?
I don't believe she was able to join today.
Okay,
Yeah,
no worries.
I know we told her, I don't think she had time.
No worries. Thanks, y'all. So you'll be hearing from Paulina and Adriana in a little bit. All right, we can go to the next slide. We're actually, some of y'all have already done the intros in the chat, so we'll just gloss over that. All right, so you are all, I'm sure, very familiar with Zoom, but if you have any sort of tech issues, you can reach out to Riley or myself. All right, let's go to the next slide. So today we are going to, we as in Home Base, we're going to do a presentation on the Violence Against Women's Act and relevant Contra Costa County continuum of care policies. And then, as I mentioned before, our colleagues from STAND will do a presentation on strategies for recognizing and working with survivors of domestic violence. Next slide, please. And some of the objectives are, one, to understand the goals and requirements of VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act. I should say, I'll be referencing VAWA instead of saying the whole thing, just because it's quicker. We will also learn about confidentiality and privacy protections for survivors of violence. We will learn about best practices for working with survivors, and we'll also address any questions or concerns that you may all have about working with survivors. Okay, next slide. And now, before we get started, we are going to launch a poll. Just to...
Yep. Oh, so Mary, I think because you're logged in, I now don't have control over the polls. So if you can either log out or handle the first poll.
I will leave right now.
Okay, sorry.
Again. I'm going.
Thanks, Mary.
Sorry, everyone.
Sorry.
Okay. Hold, please. Oh, it's not letting me do this. Is there anybody else from our team that is logged in on the CoC account? Natalie, are you also logged in on the CoC account?
I don't think so. Maybe I am. Should I log out? I might be.
Sorry, yep. Or
Okay, let me
home-based.
try.
Sorry, guys.
Jamie, it looks like
Do I just log out? Then try this. Let me know if this works.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Riley, what?
it looks like I can launch the polls.
Okay, great, sorry. Can you do that?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Thanks, Riley. Yeah, so the first one, what is your level of understanding of VAWA and its implications for serving domestic violence survivors on a scale from 1 to 5?
Are folks seeing
Okay,
it? Okay, good. I can't see it from my screen, but
Yep, I see a lot of votes
Yep.
coming in, so we'll give it a few more seconds and then I'll share the results so everyone can see.
Thanks, Riley. It looks like we have a pretty good spread. So a lot of beginners, some feeling at 2 and 3 and 4. No experts, and that's totally okay. Hopefully today will be informative, and you all feel a little bit more comfortable around VAWA and its implications. All right, I think we can share the polls. I'm not sure what y'all are seeing on your end. There we go. Okay. Perfect. Thanks for that, Riley. Let's keep going. Oops. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Riley. All right, so we are going to talk about the Violence Against Women's Act. If you can go to the next slide, Riley. Before we go into talk about the requirements, though, we wanted to give you an overview of what VAWA is, including some historical context and some definitions. And so VAWA was a landmark legislation that was passed originally in 1994, and it has been periodically reauthorized. And the most recent reauthorization was in 2022. And with that reauthorization, there was different provisions that were added, and we'll talk a little bit about those a little bit later. But so just some context is that this VAWA was initially passed in recognition that interpersonal violence was a big issue nationally, and so and recognized that there was a need for a federal response, and so that's why VAWA came to be. It's important to know that VAWA has a lot of different provisions, and they're very vast. But housing is just one small part of it, but that's what we will be focusing on today. And also, before we, it's important to note too that there has been some criticism of VAWA in prioritizing law enforcement as the answer to ending interpersonal violence. And so, oops, I'm not sure what just came up. Did you all see that as well? Sorry, I got a message from Zoom. Anyway, so there's been some criticism around prioritizing law enforcement, and so we just want to point that out as well. But really, something to note is that the idea behind VAWA and the rule really is that everyone should have a home free of violence, and that communities should work to decrease instances of homelessness caused by violence. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. And actually, I just want to say a lot of the stuff that we'll be covering, that Riley and I will be covering today, is really heavy and it's not the most exciting. So bear with us as we go through our portion of the presentation. Okay, so whom does VAWA protect? And so VAWA protects survivors of stalking, of domestic violence, of dating violence, and of sexual assault. And it protects survivors regardless of sex, gender, race, national origin, or sexual orientation. And so this means that even though it's called Violence Against Women's Act, it's not just about women. VAWA does protect all sexes and genders. And an additional thing to note is that an alleged perpetrator does not have to be does not have to have been convicted of a crime for a survivor to be protected. And VAWA also protects people that are affiliated with survivors. So that can include their children, parents, spouses, anyone else that's residing in the home with a survivor. Next slide, please. All right, so to give you a couple of, or some definitions, this one is very long, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but with the new reauthorization in 2022, the definition of domestic violence was updated. And so I bolded here economic and technical abuse or technological abuse. Those were two items that were added to the definition in 2022. And so it is a complicated definition of DV, but something you should know is that, you know, with every reauthorization, they're trying to make it broader, a broader term. And so, yeah, so I think the one thing here is that that's important to note is that the definition, the updated definition now adds economic and technological abuse. And, you know, prior to that, those were categories that folks usually would have had to argue for, but now it's explicitly stated in the definition of DV. So that's a big improvement. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. A few other definitions. So dating violence, which is violence committed by a person who is or has been in a social relationship of a romantic or intimate nature with the victim. Sexual assault is any non-consensual sexual act prescribed by law, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. Stalking, which is conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to one, fear the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. And so just something to note is that in this training, we'll be using the word survivor to refer to anyone who is a survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Okay. Can we go on to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so now that we've covered or given you a little bit of background on VAWA, we're going to talk about what HUD's VAWA final rule is and how it applied to VAWA, or how it applied VAWA to HUD CoC funded programs, which is, you know, why we're having this training today. Okay, if you can go to the next slide. All right, so we've broken down the final rule into three safeguards. The final rules, key safeguards into three sections. And so we have core housing protections, we have emergency transfer plans, and then required notices and contract terms. You can go to the next slide, Riley. All right, so this provides an overview of what HUD considers its core VAWA housing protections. So survivors cannot be evicted or denied housing solely because of their status as survivors. And also survivors cannot be evicted or denied housing solely based upon factors directly related to victimization. So if a survivor can show that their current or past victimization led to an adverse factor, that cannot be the basis for denial or eviction. So what this means is that if a survivor is denied housing or is evicted because, for example, lack of credit or criminal history or work history, if the underlying reason is related to DV or victimization, they can argue that that cannot be a factor for a denial or eviction. And so this is really important because it helps mitigate or offset some of the financial and social harm that survivors can experience that impact their housing stability. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so some limitations of VAWA protections. So the first point here, a program participant may be terminated or evicted for any violation not based on an act of DV against a tenant or an affiliated individual, so long as the tenant is not subjected to a more demanding standard than other tenants. And so what this is saying is that you can evict survivors for something that doesn't have to do with them being survivors, so long as you're not asking more of them than you would ask any other tenant. So this is preventing discrimination against survivors. And so For the second point, actual and imminent threat. So if a tenant or something about their situation cause an actual imminent threat to others, then they may be evicted. However, it's important to note that when this occurs, the claims of the survivor or situation demonstrate an actual imminent threat has to be based on actual facts. And so it can't be based on stereotypes. So an example of this is a landlord can't say, that the client has been, that they know that the client has been abused in their unit. And so all abuse escalates all abuse escalates impacts other residents, and therefore they need to evict them. So that is not a fact. And so they cannot, a landlord cannot say that they are, that they can evict them because of this stereotype that they are presenting. So that's really important to note. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so it has to be actual concerns and factual information, not just based on stereotypes. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So this is, something super important along the lines of housing first, like eviction or termination should be used only as a last resort. So eviction or termination of assistance should only occur when there are no other actions that could be taken to reduce or eliminate the threat, including but not limited to 1, transferring the victim to a different unit, barring the perpetrator from the property, contacting law enforcement to increase police presence or develop other plans to keep the property safe, and seeking other legal remedies to prevent the perpetrator from acting on a threat. And again, so this is aligned with housing first, just making sure that everyone is, working hard to prevent the loss of housing, and taking a non-judgmental and client-centered approach to assistance and preventing additional housing-related harm to survivors. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so bifurcating of leases. So landlords may bifurcate tenant-based rental assistance leases to evict, remove, or terminate assistance to a household member who engages in DV-related criminal activity without penalizing a victim. So this is really important. This is a legal option that might be available to help, basically to help keep survivors in their homes. And so this would be asking the landlord or the program to bifurcate or split the lease. So which essentially means that they are evicting the perpetrator, but allowing the survivor to stay. So so essentially splitting the lease. This slide goes into distinctions about bifurcations, how bifurcations work depending on if it's a tenant-based or non-tenant-based rental assistance, but I'm not going to go into that today, but it's here available for your review. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so as you all know, confidentiality is a critical tool in keeping survivors safe. And so another set of key VAWA provisions has to do with safeguarding survivor confidentiality. And so these provisions state that when a survivor exercises their VAWA rights, so for example, requesting an emergency transfer, which Riley will cover in a little bit, covered housing providers, including landlords, must keep confidential that someone has identified as a survivor, and that the fact that someone is exercising their VAWA rights. And so this includes keeping this information at a shared databases, so HMIS, and private from other staff working within the housing providers organization that doesn't necessarily need to know. So it's on a case need to know basis. And then some exceptions include if the survivor has requested that the information be shared, or if they have signed a written consent, if it's required for use in an eviction, or if otherwise required by applicable law. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. So before I turn it over to Riley to discuss emergency transfers, I wanted to highlight some of the key changes and new provisions that came up with the 2022 reauthorization. So the first one I've already touched base on, but The updated definition of domestic violence, as I mentioned, now includes definitions for economic abuse as well as technological abuse. It also, another big thing is it also expands the category for definition of homelessness to include any individual or family who, and I'm just going to read this aloud, is experiencing trauma or a lack of safety related to or fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous, traumatic, or life-threatening conditions related to the violence against the individual or a family member in the individual's or family's current housing situation, including where the health and safety of children are jeopardized. And 2, has no other safe residence. And 3, lacks the resources to obtain other safe or permanent housing. So let's go on to the next slide. A couple other things that came up with the reauthorization is that it adds a provision that prohibits retaliation. And so that means that survivors who have exercised their rights under VAWA are protected from retaliation or harassment. And so they can't be retaliated against, for example, if they request an emergency transfer. And just as a side note, if a survivor is being retaliated against, they can submit a complaint to HUD's Office of Fair Housing, and they would move forward with investigating the claim. Okay, another big change is that it adds a provision which protects the right to report a crime and emergencies from one's home. And so under this right, landlords, tenants, and others cannot be penalized for seeking assistance from law enforcement or emergency services. And this is actually a direct response to crime-free ordinances and nuances laws that would put pressure on landlords to evict people who frequently call, for example, call 911 or other emergency services for help. And so before, if a landlord had a tenant, that frequently called 911 because they were in danger due to abuse in their unit, the landlord could be fined and pressured to evict a survivor. And so this right to report really is a response to that. And also important to note is that it applies to all housing providers, not just VAWA covered providers that are HUD funded. And it is also, it really, what it does, it safeguards all survivors between having to choose from, between asking for help or keeping their housing. So that's a really important piece of it. All right, let's go to the next slide. And I think these are, the last couple of things from the reauthorization is that it adds the following eligible CoC program activity, which is facilitating and coordinating activities to ensure compliance with the emergency transfer plan requirement and monitoring compliance with the confidentiality protections of the confidentiality requirement. And then lastly, it allows HUD and the Attorney General to enforce VAWA using the Fair Housing Act rules. And again, complaints can be submitted to HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And just something to note is that HUD is increasing its focus on enforcement and monitoring of VAWA compliance. So, partly why we're having this training today. All right, I think the next slide is for a poll. Yes, thank you. Riley, do you mind launching that?
Yeah, no problem. So
I'm still powerless. Thank you.
Don't know how that happened, but thank you, Alex, for going over kind of an introduction into VAWA. Agree with Jamie put in the chat that the section's super technical, so feel free to ask us questions throughout the presentation. We might wait to answer it till later, but definitely don't hold on if you're confused about something. So I'm going to launch the second poll. Basically, we're now going to be talking a little bit about emergency transfers, and similar to the first poll, we wanted to get a sense of how familiar you are with helping DV survivors. Participants request an emergency transfer on a scale of 1 to 10 being beginner and 5 being expert. And we're probably going to see similar results to our initial poll, and I'll let everyone fill in their responses for a few more seconds and then share the results. All right, looks like voting has slowed down, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. The majority of you actually identified as a beginner, so I'll try to go through this section a little bit more slowly than intended, and just remind you that everything that I'm describing is in written materials in the CoC, and you can always kind of follow up with more questions about how emergency transfers work after this training today. And yeah, I will stop sharing the results and move on with the presentation. So this slide here explains the process for carrying out an emergency transfer. So first oh, actually, sorry. This isn't the exact process. It's just describing what is a VAWA emergency transfer. So these are supposed to quickly relocate survivors receiving assistance who believe there's an imminent threat of harm from further violence should they remain in their home, or survivors who were recently sexually assaulted in their home. So VAWA protects the right of people in housing assistance, like your participants, to be relocated if a harm or threat of harm is presented. And just want to reiterate what Alex said before, that this material can be heavy, it can be triggering based on your work with clients or your own personal experience. So feel free to take a step away from a moment if you need to. Now, there are multiple types of emergency transfers. There are two. So the first is an internal emergency transfer, and this is an emergency relocation of a tenant to another unit where the tenant is not a new applicant. In other words, you're moving the client within the same program, just to a new unit where they feel safer. And then an external emergency transfer is an emergency relocation of a tenant to another unit where the tenant is now a new applicant, meaning the client had to move to a new program to find a safe unit. So sometimes a new unit in the same program might not be available, or it might not be safe enough to ensure the safety of a client. So you need to move them to a new building, new program, new area. And you decide which one to pursue with a client based on what is available and also what the client deems as safe for themselves. So during this section, we're using the term safe unit. This refers to a unit that a survivor believes is safe. Emphasis on survivor. It's not what a provider, law enforcement thinks. This is really great mindset for empowering the choice of a survivor. So every CoC must have an emergency transfer plan to quickly relocate survivors receiving CoC or ESG funding assistance. So that's you all, many of you in this training today. So the CoC also must take the emergency transfer plan processes and make them available to all tenants and the public. And we'll show you where this information currently is publicly available in the Contra Costa CoC. And also, it's required that a CoC must keep records of all emergency transfer requests and outcomes of those requests, because HUD needs to receive those reports annually. So as I mentioned, the Contra Costa CoC has their emergency transfer plans publicly available in the CoC written standards, which I just popped in the chat. And the following slides are going to reflect Contra Costa's policies for CoC and ESG funded programs, not necessarily all HUD funded programs, and also doesn't apply to what other communities might be doing. And no changes related to serving survivors have been made to the written standards since this version that I just put in the chat. So This slide shows you who qualifies, who's eligible for an emergency transfer, and it's if they are a survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Those are definitions that Alex provided earlier. The participant must also express they want a transfer request. There must be consent from the participant on this end. And finally, the participant must also believe there's an imminent harm from further violence if they remain in their current dwelling, or they are a survivor of sexual assault from an incident that occurred on the premises where their unit is within 90 days before the transfer date request. This slide explains how an emergency transfer would be pursued. And no matter what, so first, a participant requests a transfer to program staff. Again, as I mentioned, it's the participant must bring about the request themselves. And the request then must be written so it can be stored in records. The participant must also certify that they qualify for a transfer, and further documentation may be required. So there's a specific certification form that I'm going to share later. And additional documentation, from our understanding, is rare. It's usually just the certification form that's used. But if anyone has other experiences about why other documentation may be necessary, let us know in the chat. So after documentation has been collected and a request formal process has started, then program staff must notify the CoC's coordinated entry manager, no matter what type of transfer it is, just to know that this request has been made. And then the coordinated entry manager will help execute the internal or external transfer based on what is needed for the participant and what is available. It's actually possible, you see on the slide here, it says or both. It's possible to pursue both transfers at the same time to kind of see which one pans out first. As you know, that housing assistance for persons experiencing homelessness in our county can be very limited. So there might not always be an available unit right away that fits the needs of a client. So it's possible to pursue both types of transfers to get the best situation that comes available first. So for internal transfers, you can see here on the left side of the screen, how it goes is that program staff should take immediate steps to carry out the transfer. The coordinated entry manager, again, as I mentioned, is notified about this, but it's really program staff who execute an internal transfer. So if a safe unit is available or is unavailable in the program that a client is currently in, you're supposed to offer the participant the option to wait for a safe unit to become available within the program they're currently in, then or request an external transfer to move to a different program, or last, pursue an internal and external transfer at the same time to transfer the participant to the first available safe unit, which I just talked about before. So you kind of have to troubleshoot with the client again to see which choice makes the most sense to them and their situation. So if an external transfer is being pursued, the coordinated entry manager facilitates the referral of the participant to the next available safe unit through the entire coordinated entry system. So the participant will have priority over all other applicants in coordinated entry. They're not placed lower in the master list and have to wait longer. They're prioritized above everyone else. And provided that the household meets all eligibility criteria required by HUD and whatever new program they're going to be referred to. So it can't just be any program, they still must fit the program criteria. It must be a good fit for them and also the new provider. it's important to note the household will not lose their homeless status by changing programs. By doing an external transfer, it's not considered an exit out of coordinated entry, so that shouldn't deter anyone from pursuing this option. Here are some other CoC policies to be aware of that again are disclosed in the Contra Costa CoC's written standards. One is that programs must prevent disclosure of the participant's new location to the alleged abuser. So this is obviously really, really important to protect the safety of the participant. Otherwise, another emergency transfer may have to be pursued. Then second, I mentioned before that the program must keep records of all emergency transfer requests, documents related to that, and also the outcomes of participants for a period of 5 years, because these will be reported to HUD. And Alex was talking about how there's been a greater emphasis on monitoring and being compliant with VAWA, so it's really important to maintain this piece. Then if you can also see CoC coordinated entry policies and procedures for more information about supporting survivors through coordinated entry. I don't have that link on hand right now. If anyone wants to put that in the chat to share with everyone, that'd be amazing. I'll stop right now just to ask if there's any specific questions about emergency transfers or if there's any material individuals want me to go over again. And you can do so by unmuting or putting your question in the chat. And thank you, Shelby, for adding the policies and procedures that I mentioned have a little bit more information about supporting survivors through coordinated entry, different from written standards that are about specific policies for carrying out emergency transfer. Okay, I will, oh, Shelby's adding in the new policies and procedures, but while that's being done, I'm gonna move on to required notices and contract terms stipulated by VAWA. So all households receiving CoC and ESG funding assistance must receive a notice of occupancy rights and a certification form at each of the following times listed here on the slide. So that's when they are denied assistance, when they are admitted to a program, when they receive notification of eviction, and if they are notified of termination of assistance. So these are all the points at which these forms must be provided. So what are these forms? One is the notice of occupancy rights. This explains VAWA protections, including the right to confidentiality, limitations of the protections, a lot of information that Alex went over earlier. The other form is the certification form to be completed by the survivor to document if there's been an incident of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, often used as documentation as part of the emergency transfer process I just described. So we're going to talk about, well, actually, I'm just going to share right now that these forms, if you haven't heard of them, you're maybe using your own, HUD posted model forms on their website. I put in the chat HUD's VAWA website. If you scroll down to the section on forms, you'll find both the notice of occupancy rights and the certification form. So what's great about these model forms is that they are compliant with VAWA. And that means they're going to be accepted by HUD if you are ever being audited or monitored. But it's also important to note that the 2022 reauthorization changes that Alex talked about, some of those they're not reflected in these forms, like revised definitions of domestic violence and economic abuse. But regardless of that, these forms are up to standards, good standards with HUD, so you can use these in your programs. And so also, it's not just HUD, Contra Costa County CoC written standards also require that this evidence is kept to be compliant. And I'm going to move to the next slide, which has a lot of information. It looks a little confusing. There's some kind of technical terms that refer to the actual VAWA Act. But basically what it actually is telling you is it's summarizing all the requirements we have discussed in this training, but it's summarizing them by the terms between CoC recipient programs and landlords, between landlords and participants, and between CoC recipients and participants. So you can kind of see that relationship of accountability and requirements. So programs account for all the required contract terms between accountable parties, often through VAWA lease addendums. So this means the lease for a unit is amended to include the provisions of the Violence Against Women Justice Department Reauthorization Act. So if you have more questions about what a lease addendum is and how to do that, we can talk more about that, but that's often how most programs make sure that these required contract terms are written and understood between all the accountable parties. This slide summarizes how to be compliant with VAWA policies and other important takeaways from today's training. So you can refer to this after this presentation as sort of a checklist. And there's nothing new here, but it's a really great way to understand. We've talked a lot about technical things, but it's really not a ton of material to keep track of. And I won't go over this right now just for the sake of time, but just want to call this out so you can remember. It's going to be in the training materials shared after today. And we have another poll before we pass it off to Stan. So I'm going to launch that now. And what we kind of wanted to do with this poll is that we wanted to get understanding of what are the biggest challenges you're facing as you serve survivors in your programs. And this list might not encompass all the challenges. That's why we have an other category. And if you feel there's a bigger barrier not represented here, you can add that to the chat. But Stan is about to present on the more practical applications of serving people experiencing homelessness who are also survivors. And we want you to be starting to think about what common challenges you come across when serving this population. And by addressing these challenges, we can also ensure as a community we're serving the survivor population more equitably. So just with that context, I'll give everyone a few more seconds to vote on what are the biggest challenges you're facing with serving survivors in your programs. And yeah, feel free to add any more context in the chat if, again, if there's a challenge not represented here you want to call out before we go into Stan's presentation, or if maybe you're a provider who's like, I actually have just never had much encounter with this population. And that's why you're here today to learn more. Whatever context you want to provide, we are all ears. All right, looks like we've kind of reached a saturation point. So I'm going to share the results. So the biggest housing barrier was overcoming, or the biggest barrier was overcoming housing barriers. So this is going to be part of Stan's presentation about how survivors often have low income and bad credit and how to deal with these situations to still make sure that survivors can obtain housing and stay in housing. And also, a lot of you voted that you struggle to connect participants to appropriate resources and assistance. That's really helpful to know. Luckily, we have one of those assistance resources on the call today. We have Stan, but hopefully we can try to talk more about what else is available in the community. And it looks like there were still some significant votes for financial implications, how it can be for your program. There can be their costs to helping participants break leases or pursue an emergency transfer, and that can impact your agency. Also, some concerns about the documentation and certification measures. Hopefully, our materials we just presented on today will help you address some of those challenges. And then also, some of you voted for appropriate, sufficient training for staff. This training today, hopefully you can share it with staff who wasn't here today. We're going to have a recording that they can watch, but training is always going to be important. And given that none of you yet said you're experts on VAWA, training is an ongoing, continual process. All right, I'm going to stop sharing the poll. Thank you all for participating. That was our last poll of the day. And I'm going to move to the next slide. This just has a few resources. They're hyperlinked, so you can refer back to them. One thing we included is HUD's VAWA webpage that has a lot of helpful resources about implementation and also just like the basics of requirements we covered today and also some of the forms we talked about today. Then we've also included housing provisions related to VAWA Act. Again, here are CoC written standards that I shared earlier. In addition to STAN being a resource, we also just wanted to highlight the Contra Costa Family Justice Center. And then also, this is another resource for your participants, the National Domestic Violence Hotline that deals with safety planning. And then I'm gonna actually stop sharing my screen because, and I'm gonna move to a video because we just wanted to highlight the intersections between domestic violence, survivors, racism, and homelessness. So we're gonna play that really quickly. The point of this is to kind of get your juices flowing about the inequities survivors experiencing homelessness face and who those survivors might be in our community. This relates to what Jamie shared earlier today in the training that we're trying to embed meaningful conversations about equity in all of our trainings and trying to reframe what has typically been a very technical training to have more of an equity lens and understanding how we can better address those barriers that you all just voted on to better serve survivors. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can pull up that video and we'll just watch it really quickly. And I don't think we'll have time for group discussion about it, but we can definitely share in the chat what feelings we have about it. All right. I'm trying to share my
It popped
screen.
up for a minute.
Yeah, I'm just not seeing the option to share with audio. Usually it's a little button on the bottom. I know that
like if you click share screen on the bottom, it doesn't allow you to say share sound.
yeah, I updated my Zoom, so it all looks different.
Oh no.
Can you see the screen now?
Nope.
Mhm.
Do you want to drop the link in the chat and I'll see if I can share it?
Sure.
Since
Thank
I can
you.
share the sound.
Yeah. Yeah, I updated my Zoom recently and it looks a little different.
We're just having technological challenges today.
Thank
Never
you.
mind that it's 2024.
Thank you all for your patience.
Okay.
Hopefully you can use this time maybe to grab some water. Just take a
Okay.
short break.
I think, okay, let me, hold on. I'm going to do this. 1 second. Share sound. Okay. Is it showing? Okay. Can you?
Yep.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system, to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it, so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Thank you for sharing, Jamie, and thank you all for watching that video with us. I think it articulates just a really important intersection that was going to do it way better than we could, and we just really like that video, and I hope you did too. If you have any thoughts and comments, you can share in the chat, but want to just share that, you know, it's a good framing for going into a conversation with STAND, and they have some more data specific to who's experiencing homelessness and who's a survivor in our own county, and also some stats from California and the nation. So it's not the last time we're kind of touching on this. I think it just it's a really interesting video, and yeah, glad to hear someone just shared they learned the new term network impoverishment from the video. I did too. I'd never heard that, and it definitely helps describe a situation that is specific barrier that survivors may face that other populations we may work with may not. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions for Homebase before we move on to Stan's presentation for the rest of the hour?
I'm not seeing any virtual hands.
That's all right. Yeah, our information was a lot of an intro. We're going to get into some more interesting kind of conversations and case studies in a bit that may elicit more conversation. But if you need any help, any questions about VAWA compliance, feel free to reach out to our Contra Costa Homebase email that I just put in the chat. There are a lot of amazing Homebase staff who have a little bit more expertise working with VAWA requirements and working with survivors. And also Homebase supports the monitoring process annually each year in Contra Costa. So if you have specific compliance questions, we're here for you. So definitely save our email. And with that, I'm going to welcome Paulina and Adriana from Stand for Families Free of Violence. We're so happy you could join us today and bring your expertise. For those who don't know, Stand is a family violence reduction agency in Contra Costa County. You may have partnered with them before for their programs and their supports for clients, or you might be totally new to them. But I'm going to let them take over the mic and talk more about their amazing mission and work. And I'm going to share their PowerPoint for them in just a minute.
Thank you, Riley. Welcome, everybody. My name is Paulina Fregoso. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the trainer and the volunteers program manager for STAN. And I'm here with Adriana, and we're going to go over some domestic violence dynamics and talk about housing as well. I'm also going to put in the chat our crisis line number and email. If anyone is ever in need of services or needs that information, I'm going to just go ahead and put that in the chat now. And I think we could go to the next slide. So I just want to go over some learning objectives for our section. So we're going to do an intro to the dynamics of domestic violence, definitions, and overall scope. We're also going to talk about some STAN services and programs. We will also be addressing housing barriers and protections and talking about some safety considerations. Next slide. So I want to go over some general group agreements for this next section as well. So we would like to ask everyone to have an electronic pause in order to be here and really absorb the information that we're going to go over. We would also like for everyone to be present and be on camera if possible. We will have pieces that are interactive, so we always enjoy having folks that are willing to interact with us. We also want to remind everybody about self-care. So as we're going to dive into some of the material of domestic violence, we really encourage everyone to take care of themselves. So if any moment this information becomes overwhelming or is just too much, please take a moment to step away and regroup and rejoin us when you are ready. So at the same time, like I just mentioned with the self-care piece, we want to use this opportunity also as a trigger warning. Like I said, some of the material may be challenging, and just due to statistics, it could be that folks that are in this call right now have also either themselves or have had family members that have experienced domestic violence. We also want to take and make space. So that just refers to the interaction pieces. If you are someone that loves to participate, but you realize you're the only one participating, we would like to make space for other folks that maybe want to participate, but are a little bit more shy to also step up and also want to participate and hear their voices. And last but not least, if you learn it here, it leaves here. If it was shared here, it stays here. So that just refers to the fact that part of the dynamics that we're learning about, we sometimes get folks that might disclose information about personal situations or family situations. So we ask folks that whatever definitions or dynamics and things that you learn about, please, take that on with you as you going back to your teams and your work. But as far as like stories, personal details, things like that, we would ask everyone to keep that here in this group as we're talking about domestic violence in general. So go ahead, next slide. So to get us started, I would like to ask everybody, what images or stereotypes come up when you hear domestic violence? And you can feel free to put that in the chat or unmute yourself. I'm just curious to know what are the images that we think about that we hear when domestic violence comes up. And if Riley, I'm not sure if you can help me read the slide, or Adriana.
I can go ahead and help you. Someone put in the chat, man hitting a woman. She made me do it. Fear. cis men as predators, cis women as targets, control, abuse. Men are always the abuser, sadness, depression, control, manipulation, control. That DV only aligns to women, applies to women, sorry. Women somehow being weak. She must like it if she stays. She keeps going back. Fear, what made him hit me. Physical violence, mental, verbal, physical abuse, abuse within the family. It was her fault. Violence. Verbal control, physical stalking, trauma, a person being physical or emotionally abused, the person, male or female, being hit and the children are afraid. Once they leave, they're fine. There's only one way to react to DV. Person, physical, mental, emotional abuse, other person. Why doesn't she just leave? Abuse against women and children, power and control.
All right. Okay, so we got a good amount of responses. Thank you everyone for responding to that. So we're going to dive into some of those stereotypes as we go through this presentation. Thank you, Riley. So just want to briefly go over some of the terms. I know Alex talked about some of these terms earlier. What I really wanted to highlight on this slide is domestic violence and IPV. So domestic violence and intimate partner violence are terms that are typically used interchangeably, specifically here at STAN. And sometimes you'll hear it in other agencies as well. They might use DV or IPV interchangeably. They both describe abuse in a romantic relationship. However, IPV or intimate partner violence moves away from the view of abusive behavior only happening in a marital relationship with the husband as an abuser. IPV acknowledges that abuse can happen in any personal, intimate relationship, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender. And IPV also describes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm by a current or former partner and or spouse. So the reason why they're used interchangeably is because IPV really encompasses all of the other aspects that DV just simply doesn't address. So things like happening within the LGBT community, if you're of different, claim a different gender, you're married or not married, right? All of those dynamics are encompassed under IPV, which is why DV and IPV are used interchangeably. So I wanted to make sure that we highlighted that here on this slide. We go to the next one. So now let's talk about how domestic violence is defined. So domestic violence is a range of behavior using a pattern over time to establish, using a pattern over time to establish power and exert control by one intimate partner over the other. And this definition is specifically based off of what survivors tell us. And we use this definition of domestic violence to be able to understand what those dynamics are, what the dynamics are that our clients are experiencing. So what we also want to highlight is that it takes an average of 7 times for a victim to leave the person who is hurting them. And it's important to always hold that in mind that statistically, that's also the most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim, especially if they leave the abuser within the past 6 months. Typically, their rates of homicide, their increased risk of homicide goes up to 70% after they've just left that abuser. Why do we think that is? Why do they have such an increased risk of potentially being killed by their partner after leaving a relationship? Feel free to either unmute yourself or put that in the chat.
Loss of control.
Loss of control. Yeah. That's probably the biggest factor that plays here, especially when the victim is actually leaving the relationship, right? The abuser typically feels like, now I've lost everything, right? There has to be a way that I retaliate now, right? So that's the mindset that they typically end up going into. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to look at the legal definition of domestic violence. So domestic violence is abuse committed against an adult or minor who is either a spouse, a former spouse, a current or former cohabitant, such as a housemate, or a person with whom the suspect has had a child, is having, or has had a dating or engagement relationship. So in the legal definition of domestic violence, you see that it includes other folks that may not necessarily be an intimate relationship, such as housemates. Now we know that housemates, specifically here in the state of California, in the Bay Area, that can be something that is very, very common that a lot of our clients could be experiencing. And yes, they could be domestic violence, but specifically here at STAN, we don't address domestic violence that happens between housemates. So I wanted to make sure we made that distinction here. Because legally, they could get help, they could get services, but our agency specifically focuses on intimate partner violence. So that's someone that they've been intimate with at some point in their life. We could go ahead and next slide. So now I want to talk about prevalence. So what we know is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience relationship violence at some point in their life. 1 in 5 teens will experience teen dating violence also at some point in their lives. And about 5 million children in the US live in homes where violence occurs. We also want to highlight that 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking. People with disability are also 1.5 more times likely to be a victim of intimate partner violence. And Black women are 3 times more likely to experience death as a result of IPV than white women. So what does this all say? What it highlights is that domestic violence is a part of a multi-generational cycle of violence. So when young people are exposed to violence at an early age, they are more likely to experience violence as they age. So if we're thinking about the 5 million children in the US that live in homes with violence occurs, as those children age, they are more likely to experience more and more extreme versions of violence as they become adults. We could go to the next slide. So now I want to highlight our community here in Contra Costa County. So Contra Costa County is a big county, right? We have more than 1 million residents within our county. So what we know for our county specifically is that there is a higher percentage of women that report intimate partner violence as compared to men. We also know that between the year 2010 and 2019, there were 86 DV-related deaths. 72 of those deaths were homicides, and 14 of those were suicides. We also know that the leading cause of deaths here in our county are from gunshot wounds, about 63%. And a key predictor of any subsequent DV homicide was prior strangulation. So this report revealed that non-fatal strangulation, or what clients also refer as to choking, is a key predictor for any subsequent homicide. So increasing the odds by more than 7 times that the survivor's abuser will eventually kill them, just by that one factor. And that's huge. That's huge. Especially because what we experience in our line of work is that a lot of our survivors will downplay the choking. because they don't see it as a big deal, right? For some reason, it's something that gets downplayed a lot. But if you ever have any clients that disclose something of choking, because that's the word that they'll use, we automatically know that that person has a higher increased risk of being potentially killed by their partner. Go next slide. So far what we've learned is that domestic violence can impact anyone in a family unit, from infants to elders. Domestic violence has similarities, but is unique to every family, every relationship. We also know that domestic violence is heavily influenced by society. And we know that domestic violence does not discriminate against any race, age, gender, income level, or sexual orientation. Next slide. So now I want to talk about some tactics of abuse. What you see here on your screen is called the power and control wheel. Now I know it's a little small, but you'll see that there's 8 different smaller triangles within this circle. And on the outside, you'll see that it says physical violence and sexual violence. So what this is that this entire wheel explains some of the tactics that are used in a DV relationship. So all these tactics in the middle, so using coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, denying, minimizing, or blaming, using children, using privilege, using economic abuse. All of those that I just named are specific tactics that are used to maintain power and control within the relationship. If these tactics are being used and the victim is not complying, then the actual forms of violence will come out. So the physical violence, the sexual violence, which is on the outer part of this circle. So for example, in using intimidation, that could be things like maybe displaying weapons, using their body language to intimidate the other person. It could also be using emotional abuse. So that's using put downs, name calling, using isolation. So not letting them leave, not letting them see their family members, see friends, talk to them. Can anyone give me examples of what denying, minimizing, or blaming would look like? You guys can add that in the chat as well. What is an example of denying, minimizing, or blaming in a DV relationship?
I never hit you. It's your fault that I hit you. It's not what I said. You made me do this.
You made me do this? What about using children? What are some examples of using children as a tactic of abuse? How do you guys think that looks like?
You're the reason I get this way. Sorry, that was the last one. I will take the children away from you. No wonder the child hates you. You don't raise these kids right.
Right. So making them feel guilty, right? Feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, right? It could even be during visitations if folks are separated and there's some type of court order visitation or things like that. It can even happen during visitations. The one thing that I always think about when I think about using children is there was a case that happened last summer in Sacramento during a visitation. I believe it was in a public space. I don't remember exactly where, but this happened in Sacramento last summer. And during a visitation exchange, the father killed not only the children but the mother as well. So things like that and visitations, they absolutely happen. So it's always about safety planning when it comes to that. What about using privilege? So this could be male privilege, so using their male privilege, or able-bodied privilege. What do you think that looks like when we're talking about tactics of abuse? Did any? Okay.
Just a housewife, not feeding someone, not taking them out of the house if they're disabled or need help, refusing to drive someone to a medical appointment, abuse against disabled individuals. You have to have sex with me because you are my wife. Withholding information, use extended family to intimidate the victim. You're just eating and watching Netflix while I'm struggling to make money.
Yes, yes. Okay. What about using economic abuse? So what does economic abuse look like?
Withholding money.
Withholding money. So not just withholding money, it can even maybe just be giving you an allowance, right? It may be not an allowance to necessarily survive, just the most minimal basic amount that they feel like giving you, really. I see the
Making the
comments.
victim
Bank
turn in a
accounts.
paycheck over to abuser.
Yes.
If a person being abused doesn't have legal status, the person who caused them harm uses it to leverage control of financials, not allowing someone to get a job, removing them from an account, lying about where the money is going, restricting their means to survive, anger about over not paying the bills when they don't have money to do it, using money to entice children, single income earned by one partner and the other has to stay to support themselves, scrutinizing everything they buy, withholding money and holding all of the financial accounts, spending on frivolous things, threatening homelessness, taking credit cards out of the partner's name.
Yeah, everything that you guys named, you guys are spot on for that. And the last one that we haven't talked about just yet is using coercion and threats. So those are just like we were talking about intimidation, right? So these are actual threats to show power over them, right? So this can be threats to suicide, threats to call the authorities, threats to call CFS, threats to call ICE, making you drop all the charges, things like that. Thank you guys for participating in the chat. Next slide. So now let's talk about the cycle of violence. As you see here, we have 3 different phases. So we use this model to help people understand the way which violence begins to enter a relationship and then becomes a part of a series of phases that a relationship moves through. So in the first phase, this is called the honeymoon phase or the calm stage. This first happens in the early part of a new relationship. So these are where things are going well, everything feels calm, everything feels safe. Everyone really is showing their best self. That's what's happening in the honeymoon phase. In an unhealthy relationship, negative behaviors begin to show up over time, causing tension to increase. The relationship may begin to break down, and an abuser may begin to display any of the violent or controlling behaviors we just discussed. So the victim notices this and begins to feel like they're walking on eggshells. And they may adopt behaviors aimed at de-escalating the tension and returning the relationship to its earlier dynamics. So now we're in the tension building phase. So as this continues, the tension builds and eventually triggers the first act of violence. That could be physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, and it's often referred in this model as the actual explosion, the violence. So after the abuse, the relationship moves into what we call the new honeymoon phase. So this is typically characterized by behaviors that promote reconciliation. So what do you guys think that might look like? What do you guys think that the second honeymoon phase might look like after violence has happened? And you guys can write that in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself.
Presents,
Presents.
buying flowers,
Flowers, yes.
I love you, I'll never do it again, I'm sorry, I won't do it again, apologizing, promising never to do it again, love bombing, I love you
Love
so
bombing.
much, going on trips,
Yeah,
including
so
them.
exactly what you guys, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there's more. Go
No,
for
no,
it.
you're fine. I was gonna say that everything that you guys are saying, the love bombing, the gifts, the I love you, the I'm sorry, this is never gonna happen again. All of that happens in that second honeymoon phase, right? So we started off in the first honeymoon. As time went on, right, we begin to build the tension. Then we had the actual explosion of violence. And then we're back at the second honeymoon phase, right? All the I'm sorry's, I love you, and everything is going on. So during this reconciliation, the abuser will feel all that remorse and try to do everything in their power to convince the victim that it won't happen again. So all those typical behaviors show up, right? And they're really trying to be their best self. However, without intervention, this cycle rarely ends at that time. More typically, it will continue, and over time, that honeymoon period gets shorter so that the tension rebuilds quicker and explosions become more frequent. Over time, that honeymoon phase may actually completely disappear in violent relationships. I think we could go to the next slide. And that's just, showing you what that looks like, right? We're going in circles typically in these dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier, to break this cycle, on average, it takes 7 times in order for this cycle to break. And that's not for everybody. Some folks it's more, some folks it's less. But on average, they might go through these cycles 7 times before they actually are able to leave. All right. So now I want to tell you a little bit about us, about STAND, who we are. So we are the only comprehensive family violence reduction agency in Contra Costa County. STAND assists more than 10,000 clients annually and provides free comprehensive services through 3 distinctive program areas. So that's our Changing the Future, which is our prevention, Saving Lives, which is intervention, and Rebuilding Families, which is our treatment. And we're going to talk about some of these programs in the next slide. So here are a list of most of our services, or actually I think all of them are here. So starting off with our Saving Lives. So as you see here, we have our 24/7 operating crisis and counseling line, which I will go ahead and actually add that information again here to the chat. So this is a staff 24/7, 365 service that is actually based out of our residential facility called our Rolling Mullen Center. So this is where qualified staff and volunteers offer multilingual crisis counseling, safety planning, and information and referrals to community resources. In addition, clients are also screened into entrance of emergency shelters, support groups, or if in need of restraining orders. Our emergency shelter is a 24-bed emergency, a 24-bed facility that is actually also based at our RMC campus, and it provides a safe place for parents and children where they can stay for 8 weeks or more, and that's on a case-by-case basis. Clients can participate in daily meetings, ongoing case management, and access to housing referrals, legal advocacy, and other services. This is typical. Our emergency shelter is available to adults of all gender identities, and their children are accepted into shelter if they qualify. So they have to meet the qualifications in order to get into emergency shelter. We also have our DV liaisons, which are co-located across the county. Not only do they serve the walk-in clients at their host locations, but they also have referrals from the crisis line and other community partners. So they do everything from facilitating the support groups in both English and Spanish. They also can provide legal advocacy and attend to, court proceedings as victim advocates. However, they do not provide any legal advice. They are simply there to just be an accompaniment to that victim, to the court. They provide case management. They also assist with restraining orders and much more. On our Rebuilding Families section, you'll see that we have our transitional housing. At this time, transitional housing only takes internal referrals, meaning that we only take referrals from clients that are current STAN clients. So that's how you're able to apply into transitional housing. So transitional housing is located also at our RMC campus, and it's up to 18 months of independent supportive housing. For transitional housing, we only have 7 units that are meant for mostly families. Clients receive case management, vocational services, counseling, and legal advocacy. These units are typically fully furnished, and they can take everything with them when they move into permanent housing. And for the transitional housing, under the VAWA requirements, their rent is actually optional. And that's something that started maybe about 2 years ago or a year ago. I think it was actually 2 years ago. We then have our nonviolence program, which is the only program that our agency charges a fee for. So the nonviolence program is a 52-week batters intervention program. And the goal is to support those caused harm to engage in a process that allows them to be accountable for the impact of the violence they have caused. So this is typically something that they meet every week for 2 hours. And the guidelines are all set in place by the Department of Probation here in Contra Costa County. They used to be in various parts of the county, including the jail. However, they are now mostly virtual. And as I mentioned, this is the only program that STAN charges an actual fee for. We also have our children's counseling program, which is free counseling for children who have experienced and or witnessed violence, domestic violence. The services are provided in English and Spanish at all STAN sites, and treatment can be provided to children as long as they need until they turn 18. Under Changing the Future, we have our youth education services, otherwise known as YES, which is primarily based out of in West County. And this program is a school and community-based prevention program that provides education, youth leadership development, and training to teens in regards and topics of teen dating violence. So it's really meant to shift attitudes and increase healthy relationships amongst middle school and high school age students. Then we have our Speakers Bureau, which is aimed to educate Contra Costa about DV and introduce the community to STAN. So these are things that we do, such as community presentations and tabling events in the community as well. And we also have our volunteers program, which I am the manager for. So we are meant to bring in volunteers into all parts of our agency. Could go ahead and go to the next slide. And I will let Adriana take it on from here.
So we spoke a little bit about housing barriers earlier, and we just want to break it down a little bit more. So as you know, a lot of times they don't have income, they're low to no income, they're still living with their abuser, bad landlord referenced, prior evictions due to domestic violence, lack of steady employment, lack of proof of employment if they're working under the table, maintaining confidentiality from abuser, credit history, financial abuse linked to financial abuse, tactics of abuse such as isolation, violence escalating after they leave. As we know, that is the most dangerous time for survivors. Sorry. There are many barriers to leaving a violent relationship: children, financial dependence, isolation from the abusive tactics. However, we are going to focus specifically on housing barriers clients may face within a violent relationship. 3 examples. I'm sorry. If Housing First is one of the programs that we have for victims of abuse. For victims of abuse, Housing First helps supplement some of these barriers. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover all of it. We also have another program called Project Home Safe that also helps them rebuild their lives. That program, I have a few of our co-providers here, so feel free to unmute and help me out if I'm missing anything. But Project Home Safe is basically a program that we're implementing. It's fairly new, that helps clients over a year's time to basically rebuild their lives. They are providing Project Home Safe is a rapid rehousing program. So it basically gives them a year's time to increase their income, not worry about rent, work on their resumes, build a credit history, work with landlords in order to give themselves a good reference if they need to move afterwards. There is case management support. Thank you, Teresa. And things such as that. So I'm gonna go a little bit off topic because we're gonna be going into only 20 minutes to talk, and I don't want to give you guys all a bunch of different lectures about programs that you might already be familiar with or might not. If you guys do have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm gonna try to go over it as quickly as possible and give you as much information as we can. Let me see. Is there any way I can get control over the slides?
If you want to share, that's totally cool. And you could also, I can continue to share and you can just tell me when to move.
Okay, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we are going to be sharing a little bit of the statistics over homelessness. So 1 in 5 women become homeless in California. 1 in 5 women who become homeless in California are fleeing their homes to escape the violence or escape the abuse of an intimate partner. Among those who report IPV, in the 6 months prior to homelessness, 42 reported continuing to experience it during homelessness. 17% of homeless women report experiencing intimate partner violence within 6 months. In the 6 months before becoming homeless, violence or abuse as a reason for leaving their housing for 13% of participants, 20 of all cis women, 9% of cis men. Among all participants, 26% of the participants were Black, reported Black as one of their racial identities. 12% of participants identified as Native American, Alaskan Native, and 1% of as one of their racial identities. 35% of studies participants identified as Latino / Latinx. Next slide, please. Okay. No to low income. So again, one of the barriers is no to low income, no employment history. So they're not able to show that to their landlords in order to qualify for an apartment or a home, or a loan if they qualify for a house. A lot of times we're stay-at-home parents, and now they don't have any childcare. So they are not able to apply for a job right away. They need to be able to identify adequate childcare. They need to feel comfortable leaving their kids with someone, because if anyone here is a parent, you know it's not always easy to just get a babysitter. You have to vet them. You have to be able to feel comfortable leaving them, because then you won't be able to think about work when you're constantly worrying if your child is okay. So if they have no income, then they can't show employment history. If they have low income, then they don't qualify for the 3 times the rent in order to qualify for an apartment, or they're not able to receive benefits because they're considered to have more income than needed for food stamps or Medi-Cal, but they're not making enough money in order to qualify for an apartment here in California, because who can qualify for an apartment in California nowadays, right? Bad credit due to financial abuse, or their abuser getting their Social Security, then now they have loans out in their names that have never been paid. They have credit cards that they didn't even know existed that are maxed out and never been paid. They have evictions and or things that classify as identity theft. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is one of the benefits that working with Stan can give clients, which is the breaking the lease. If they're not able to remain in their apartment or their home due to the abuse, but are scared of the repercussions of an eviction on their credit, then they can come to agencies such as Stan's that work with victims of abuse, and we are able to certify that they are in fact going through domestic violence and need to break their lease and should not be held accountable for the rest of the lease termination, because a lot of times that could either lead to bad credit, or they would have to pay for the rest of the contract. Does anyone have any questions about this specific part? So this is Stan's portion. This is where we would certify that we are in fact a provider. And then the next slide is what needs to be provided to the client in order for them to fill out. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So this is the 14-day notice of termination. This basically tells them, like, within 14 days, I'm going to have that place cleared out. None of my belongings will be there. I'm no longer going to be paying rent, and I have any of these to prove that I am a victim, which would be a temporary restraining order or an emergency protective order provided by police, a copy of a police report that was issued within the last 180 days, or a documentation from a qualified party such as a doctor, psychologist, licensed clinical social worker, or domestic violence or sexual assault sexual assault counselors, which we are here at Stan. So there is no stand in Sacramento. I just saw that in the chat. But there should be different programs that are able to provide something similar. If you have any questions, you can, I think our phone numbers are going to appear on here at some point. You can reach out, and I'm more than happy to help you get connected. Oh, yeah. Weave is a domestic violence provider in Sacramento. Can we go to the next slide, please? Sorry if I'm going really quickly. You guys are welcome to slow me down a bit, but I'm trying to race on with the clock. When referring clients to stand, when to refer clients to stand. When a client tells you that they're experiencing relationship violence and they want support, clients are sharing that minor children or themselves need additional support and healing. That means that the abuse happened a while back, but they're still dealing with it. Then we're more than happy to help them, connect them to services to help them heal. Clients are sharing that a person who has caused them harm is violating their restraining order. If there's one active, clients are sharing that the person who caused them harm is not complying with court orders related to child custody and visitation, because as we know, a lot of times they're going to be using their children as ways to communicate, even though the court is saying that they're not supposed to. The client is having a hard time reporting restraining order violations to law enforcement. They don't know how to do it. They don't know when to do it. They don't know if it even classifies as someone who they are hurting, as if it classifies as a violation. Clients share that the court date is coming up for a domestic violence restraining order, or it's coming to renewal. Then we can connect them to domestic violence liaison, who is able to go to court with them so that they're not alone. Again, we're not there to represent them, but we are there for support. The client isn't sure if they filed a domestic violence restraining order or have a copy on their person. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, case example. And for this, I will need you to unmute and help us out here. A rapid housing provider reached out asking for DV shelter resources, DV or shelter resources, because they have a participant who is housed requesting to move units because an ex-partner located her, jeopardizing her safety. When the program moved her into the unit, she was working, but since has lost her job. What would be some of the pushbacks from housing navigators?
You guys could unmute or put it in the chat, whichever one.
The ability to afford a unit since they're no longer employed. The person coming back and having or wanting to relocate again.
What are some other pushbacks? Thank you for that. Brittany said, are they looking for a new job?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. What would some landlord concerns be?
Let me check the chat. Let's see. Paying
Abuser.
rent, ability to do so.
Mm-hmm.
The abuser is maybe causing disruption. Do you know how the ex located you?
What are some community resources available that can help? Dan, family.
FJC, CVS.
Okay. What are some possible solutions? So there's no wrong answers. What would be something that you guys are able to do in order to help with a situation such as this? Violence restraining order, emergency transfer. Anything? Go to the next slide, please. Considerations for you. Protective orders can include kick-out orders, among other things, but they are not always an option for all clients. When we say that they're not always an option for all clients, it's a lot of times they don't feel comfortable doing so. A domestic violence restraining order can sometimes cause more harm than good because at the end of the day, they're just a piece of paper. Unless if that piece of paper doesn't cause any consequence to the abuser, they're going to continue to go ahead and violate it. They're not going to get many repercussions unless the survivor is actively calling law enforcement. Otherwise, there's no reason, there's no way that the protective order can help them. And a lot of times, there's not much that the police can do unless the abuser is still on site, meaning that it's not always an option. Framing is important. Not all DV victims will identify as a DV victim. A lot of times people don't understand that DV isn't just physical abuse, that there's financial, emotional, religious abuse. There's all forms of abuse, and it's very hard for people to sometimes see themselves as a victim. Introduce stand and provide safe options. You can just tell them, hey, you mentioned something that put up a red flag for me, something that made me feel a little bit concerned for you. If it's a safe option for you, please reach out to this agency. They'll be able to help. Just, it doesn't have to be like, you have to call them now. We're right here now. A lot of times people don't perceive that very well. And if they're not seeing themselves as a victim, they won't like someone telling them you're a victim. They have to be able to assimilate it themselves, and sometimes just telling them like, hey, there are some resources you can reach out to, see if it fits. If it doesn't fit, we'll look at other options. DV calls are the most dangerous and most lethal calls to law enforcement. So again, they are the ones, because most times when law enforcement is receiving the call, it's because it's already escalated to it being extremely dangerous for the victim. So imagine if police are becoming involved now, there's another added method of them losing control. They're not going to want to lose that control, and a lot of times it can end in altercations, especially if weapons are involved in any way. Stalking, and strangulations are highly correlated with lethality. 3 women a day are murdered by their current or former partner. Remember, leaving a violent relationship is the most dangerous time, and not all victims want to leave or will leave. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. You guys have any questions? I know we have a very short amount of time left, but I do want to open it up. I know we went over it very quickly, so if any questions do come up, please feel free to reach out to myself or Paulina or our crisis line.
I want to thank you both, all 4 of you actually, sorry, all 4 of you for a really great training. I did a quick survey in the chat. We just helps us assess how our trainings are they meeting your needs? We are going to send out all of these slides and a recording to everyone, but also if you have questions that come up later or you didn't want to ask them here, there's everybody's contact information also in the slide deck. So I can hang out here for a little while and leave it open if folks want to ask questions, but also want to remind you that you can reach out to them directly, both for stand and home base. If you have questions about how to implement VAWA, to reach out to home base, and any questions around providing direct services for people struggling with domestic violence. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for having us.
Yes,
And again, if anyone has any questions or anything wants to follow up, please feel free to email us.
that's great. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording.